The eyes in the rear view. Ethan slumped into the driver's seat, the weight of another 12-hour shift dragging him down. His hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing holding him together. The roads were quiet, the kind of quiet that spoke of emptiness, like the world was holding its breath. It was after midnight, way too late for most people to be awake, but not for Ethan. He was used to the late hours. The city was just starting to lose its life, and he, like a ghost in the night, was driving through it. He flicked on the radio, but it was nothing but static. A crackle. A pop. The kind of noise that made you feel like something was trying to claw its way through. He clicked it off, the silence more comforting than the weird hum of the station. Outside, the streetlights passed in regular intervals, their dull yellow light casting shadows that seemed just a little too long, a little too deep. The headlights of his car reflected off the damp road, cutting through the fog that had begun to roll in. It had rained earlier, and now everything was slick with the remnants of the storm. He had hoped to make it home quickly, crawl into bed, and forget about the day. But even though the rain had stopped, the air still felt thick, like something was waiting. That's when he saw them. At first, it was just a flicker. A glint in the rearview mirror. He didn't think much of it. He glanced back, but the road was empty. Nothing was behind him except the shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the asphalt. Ethan let out a long breath, feeling foolish for being so jumpy. But the sensation lingered, creeping into the back of his mind like a whisper he couldn't quite make out. He adjusted the mirror, just a quick nudge to make sure everything was fine. He didn't want to be the type of guy who got paranoid about things that weren't there. But when he did, when the mirror clicked into place, he saw them again. Two eyes. A pair of eyes staring back at him from the rearview mirror. The breath caught in his throat, and his hand instinctively jerked to the wheel. He looked again. Nothing. The road was still empty behind him. His heart thudded hard in his chest. Was it just the reflection? He wasn't sure, but the sensation of being watched didn't go away. He reached for the radio again, but it was still just static. The car was humming steadily, but it felt off, like the engine was too quiet. Too smooth. It shouldn't have felt so perfect after the way the storm had passed. Nothing felt right, and his gut was telling him to pull over. He wanted to stop, get out of the car, stretch his legs, maybe take a breath of the cool night air. But instead, he kept driving, the city lights blurring by. The eyes in the mirror weren't there anymore, but the feeling remained. It was as if they had never really left, lingering in the dark behind him, just out of view, but watching, waiting. It wasn't long before his thoughts started to wander. Ethan had always been a rational man, grounded in reality, the kind of guy who didn't believe in ghosts, shadows, or things that went bump in the night. But there was something about this, something that gnawed at the edges of his mind. He'd seen something. The eyes, he was sure of it. But why were they in the rearview mirror? And what did they mean? His thoughts swirled as he drove, the miles stretching on like an endless black ribbon ahead of him. He passed the exit for his neighborhood, but for some reason, he didn't take it. The strange sensation lingered, and though he couldn't explain it, he felt like if he went home, it would only get worse. The city streets blurred by, and Ethan kept driving, past the usual landmarks, past the corner store, past the flashing neon signs that usually brought him a sense of comfort. But tonight, none of it felt right. Then, as he glanced again into the rearview mirror, he saw it. The reflection of a figure. No, not a figure, just eyes. But they were clearer now. Closer. Staring. They weren't his eyes. And they weren't the eyes of anyone he knew. A jolt of panic gripped him, and his hands tightened on the steering wheel. This wasn't just a trick of the light. This wasn't his imagination. These were real eyes. Eyes that he couldn't explain. Eyes that should not have been there. Suddenly, the road ahead seemed unfamiliar. The glow of the streetlights felt colder, sharper. Ethan glanced to his left, then to his right. empty as it had been all night. But when he looked back at the rearview mirror again, the eyes were gone. Only the feeling remained. The sensation of something, or someone, watching him, following him, waiting. Ethan slammed his foot on the gas pedal. The engine roared, the tires screeched on the wet asphalt, and the car shot forward, faster than it should have. He couldn't stop. He couldn't pull over. He just had to keep going. He was already in too deep. Are you brave enough to uncover the truth behind the eyes in the rearview mirror? Follow Ethan's journey through the darkest corners of his own mind and confront the terror that lurks just behind him. What will you do when the thing you fear most is already watching you? Stay tuned for the next part of the story, or share your thoughts with us. What would you do if you saw eyes in the rearview? Comment below, and don't forget to share this eerie tale with others who dare to read. The eyes grow closer. The night seemed endless. The streets that had once felt familiar now twisted and bent into shapes he couldn't recognize. Ethan's foot pressed harder on the gas, pushing the car faster than he should have been going. But the urgency was there, an unspoken need to outrun whatever was chasing him, even though he had no idea what it was. The rearview mirror shimmered under the dim light of the streetlights, and for a brief moment, the eyes were back. A fleeting reflection, a flicker of movement. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He was sure of it now. Those eyes were real. The question that gnawed at him like an animal in his chest was what they were and why they were following him. But what troubled him more was how quickly the terror had set in. How fast the world had changed. He let out a long, shaky breath, trying to steady his pulse, but it wasn't enough. The image of the eyes, those eyes, kept flashing through his mind like a haunting image he couldn't shake. Were they his eyes? Were they someone else's? No, they were cold, empty, dead. He glanced at the rearview mirror again. The car behind him was still there, a faint silhouette of headlights cutting through the fog, following too closely for comfort. He could have sworn it hadn't been there moments ago, and yet it was. But it wasn't just the car he was worried about. No, it was the eyes that stared back at him every time he looked. He told himself it was just the darkness playing tricks on him. Maybe it was the tiredness from his shift, or the long hours on the road. He needed to focus on getting home. He needed to get out of the car, get into the safety of his apartment, and forget all of this. But no matter how much he tried to ignore it, his eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror. The car behind him was still there, too close now. He could make out the shape of the vehicle more clearly, a dark sedan, too dark, too polished. It looked almost new, too shiny for a late-night commuter. But he couldn't see the driver. Couldn't make out anything behind the windshield. It was as if the car was just an empty shell, a shadow trailing him. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter. He couldn't let this go on. He couldn't just keep driving, lost in some paranoid spiral that made his skin crawl. He needed to pull over. He needed to stop the madness before it consumed him. His fingers twitched, and his knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and he could feel the cold air from the open window cutting through the car. He wiped his palms on his jeans, trying to steady himself. Just look again. One more time. He couldn't resist. He turned his gaze back to the rearview mirror. And there they were. The eyes. Only now, they were clearer, more distinct. He could see the details, the whites, how they were almost too wide. How the pupils were dilated, as though the thing watching him wasn't just human. He shuddered and slammed his foot on the brake, jerking the car forward before swerving to the side of the road. The headlights of the car behind him didn't change, didn't slow down. It was still there, getting closer, but it never fully passed. The figure remained a few feet behind him, like it was waiting, watching. Ethan jerked his head around, trying to catch a glimpse of the other car, but nothing. Just the darkness, the fog, the endless night. His own car was the only thing he could focus on now. His breath was shallow, his pulse rapid. He had to do something. Why isn't it leaving? A flash of movement caught his eye in the side mirror. The eyes again. This time, they seemed to shift and blink, and for the first time, they felt alive, like they were waiting for him to notice them. Without thinking, Ethan pulled back onto the road, his heart racing as he sped away, watching the car in his rearview mirror. It was still there, following him with relentless persistence, and every time he glanced at the mirror, the eyes seemed to be just a little closer, just a little clearer. A voice in his mind told him to call someone, anyone, to tell them what was happening. But he didn't want to sound crazy. He didn't want to explain something that he couldn't even explain to himself. What was going on? Was it just his exhaustion? His mind playing tricks on him after the long shift? Or was something else happening? Something more sinister? Ethan passed the familiar landmarks again. Stores, gas stations, the neon signs blinking in the distance. But nothing felt familiar anymore. He felt as though the world around him had shifted. Every streetlight cast a shadow too sharp, too dark, and every turn seemed to take him farther from home. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Ethan fumbled for it with trembling hands, pulling it out and unlocking the screen. It was a text from his best friend, Mark. "You still on the road? You okay?" He stared at the message, a sudden sense of dread filling him. What if he told Mark? What would Mark say? What would anyone say? There was no way to explain what was happening. He couldn't even explain it to himself. Ethan typed back quickly. "Yeah, just tired. Almost home." He felt like a liar, even as his fingers hit the send button. It wasn't the truth, and the more he lied to himself, the more he could feel that thing in the rearview mirror, like it was somehow listening, somehow knowing that he wasn't being honest. He couldn't keep driving forever. But the car behind him, still there. It never changed position. No matter how fast or slow he went, it stayed right on his tail. That unease from earlier was turning into something worse, something darker. His grip tightened on the wheel. He was losing it. He could feel it. The eyes, those eyes, they were too familiar now. He could almost hear them watching. Hear them waiting. There was something pulling him toward them, something that he didn't understand, but it was growing stronger with each passing second. Then, something made him stop. Something snapped inside of him. Ethan pulled the car over again, this time in a much more desolate part of the road. He slammed the car into park and threw open the door. The air outside was colder than he expected. His breath formed little clouds in front of his face as he stepped into the fog. The road was empty, quiet. The car behind him was gone. No headlights, no shadows, only silence. But the sensation didn't fade. It was still there. He could feel it. The eyes, watching. He turned back to his car, to the rearview mirror. The reflection was different. The eyes were still there. But now, something else had joined them. A face. A face that wasn't his. And it was grinning. Ethan thought he could outrun whatever was stalking him. But now, the eyes had grown more insistent. More alive. What will happen when the creature in the rearview mirror finally catches up? You won't want to miss what's coming next. Keep reading to uncover the terrifying truth, or share your thoughts with us below. What would you do if you saw eyes staring back at you from the darkness? The reflection of fear. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed the moment he saw that face in the rearview mirror. It wasn't just the eyes anymore. It wasn't just the sensation of being followed. Something had come alive in the reflection, something otherworldly. He stood outside the car for what felt like an eternity, staring at the darkened road. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of rain, though the sky above was clear. The fog, thick as milk, swirled around the base of the streetlights, muting everything in an unsettling haze. The road was empty. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the occasional chirp of a far-off bird or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Ethan should have felt relief, should have felt like he was free, but he didn't. The eyes were still there, watching him from the depths of his mind. He could feel their presence, even if they weren't in the mirror. Even if the car behind him was gone. The weight of it was suffocating. It was only then that he realized how quiet everything was. Too quiet. There was no one else on the road, no other cars, no pedestrians, nothing. The world felt empty, like he was the last person alive. He glanced back at his car, his hand trembling as he reached for the door handle. The silence was deafening, but he didn't dare stay out there any longer. As he slid into the driver's seat, he felt a sense of isolation settle in his chest like a cold stone. The engine roared to life, and he slammed his foot on the accelerator, desperate to get moving again. His eyes flicked at the rearview mirror as he turned onto the highway. He couldn't help it. He had to look. The face was gone. But the eyes, they were still there. Empty. Cold. It was as though they were waiting for him to acknowledge them. Ethan exhaled sharply, trying to keep his mind from spiraling. He could feel a familiar dread creeping back into his bones, the way it always did. It had been with him all his life, an old friend that made itself known when things felt too good. He had learned to live with it, to ignore it. But now, it was something else entirely. As he drove, his mind raced through a dozen different explanations. Was he hallucinating? Could the exhaustion from work be playing tricks on him? Maybe it was the stress, the long hours, the way his personal life had fallen apart after his last breakup. Could all of this be some weird breakdown? But no, the face, the eyes. They weren't just in his mind. They were real. They were there. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. The screen lit up with another message from Mark. "Dude, you still good? You're freaking me out." Ethan stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. "I'm fine. Just got lost. Almost home." He sent the message and tossed the phone into the passenger seat, but his hands were already shaking again. His grip on the wheel was tight, too tight. The lights of the city grew dimmer as he drove farther from the center. The further he went, the more isolated he felt, the closer the eyes seemed to get. He didn't know how long he'd been driving, but the road seemed to stretch on forever. He didn't recognize any of the street signs anymore. He glanced at the dashboard. His gas was low. The needle was dipping dangerously close to empty. He needed to find a gas station. But something stopped him. The unease, the presence in the back of his mind. He could feel it more now, a pressure building behind his eyes. Like something was pushing on him from the inside. It was the same feeling he got when he was about to make a huge mistake. When something was about to go terribly wrong. And then, without warning, he heard it. A sound that shouldn't have been there. A tapping. He froze, his heart racing. The tapping was coming from behind him. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like fingernails gently tapping against glass. The sound reverberated in his ears, growing louder with every passing second. Ethan's pulse spiked as he whipped his head to the side. The back seat was empty. His eyes darted between the mirrors. Nothing. The car was empty. But the tapping didn't stop. His gaze snapped back to the rearview mirror. There, in the reflection, was the face again, more distinct this time. The grin was wider, almost unnatural, stretching across the face like a grotesque mask. The eyes, though, those eyes, they were filled with malice, filled with something that felt ancient and hungry. The thing behind him wasn't just following him anymore. It was waiting, watching, almost, taunting him. The tapping intensified. It wasn't coming from the backseat anymore. It was coming from inside the rearview mirror. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the tapping turned into a slow, deliberate scratching sound. It scraped at the edges of his mind. His heart was pounding in his chest, his breath shallow, ragged. He slammed on the brake, sending the car lurching to a stop at the side of the road. The tires squealed against the pavement. The scratching stopped. Ethan didn't wait another second. He threw the car into park and wrenched open the door. He stepped out into the night, his shoes crunching on gravel. The cold air hit him, but it didn't offer the comfort he was hoping for. The night felt heavier now, suffocating. He glanced around, hoping to see another car, hoping to see someone. But there was nothing. The road stretched out, empty and cold. The fog had thickened again, and the headlights of his own car barely cut through it. He took a few deep breaths, trying to calm himself, trying to force the terror to recede, but it was no use. The feeling was back. That awful, crushing weight. The thing in the rearview mirror was still there, still waiting. He turned back to the car, his pulse thrumming in his ears. With a shaky hand, he reached for the door handle again and pulled it open, just as the scratching began once more. This time, it was louder, more insistent. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The eyes were staring at him, waiting. But this time, there was a word. It wasn't spoken. It wasn't a voice. But it was there, written in the reflection, as if the words were etched into the mirror itself. Come closer. Ethan's blood ran cold. Ethan's mind is unraveling, and the thing in the rearview mirror is no longer a distant terror. It's real. It's alive. What will Ethan do when the darkness calls him closer? You won't believe what happens next. Keep reading to follow his terrifying descent, or share your thoughts below. What would you do if something started calling you from your own reflection? Don't miss the next chapter in this chilling tale. The mechanic's warning. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the relentless thumping echoing in his ears like the ticking of a clock. The words, "Come closer," had burned into his mind, seared into his thoughts, and every time he tried to push them away, they clawed their way back. He slammed the door of his car shut, not even sure what he was trying to accomplish by getting out. There was no one on the road, no one to help him. He was completely alone in this suffocating silence. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps as he stood frozen by the side of the road, staring at the headlights of his car cutting through the mist like some unnatural beacon. The scratching from the rearview mirror had stopped, but the unease remained, pressing on him like a weight. Every part of his body screamed to him to leave, to get out of here, but he wasn't sure where here was anymore. He wasn't even sure where he was driving to. Home. His apartment felt like a distant memory now, like the safe place he used to know was no longer a refuge. He couldn't go home, not with that thing following him. His phone buzzed again, pulling him back from the brink of his panic. Ethan's fingers shook as he fumbled for it, too afraid to ignore it. It was Mark again, this time calling him. Ethan stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. The second he pressed the green button, Mark's voice crackled through the receiver. "Dude, what the hell is going on?" Mark's voice was urgent, but there was an undercurrent of worry that Ethan hadn't heard before. "You okay? You've been acting weird lately." "I'm fine," Ethan said quickly, his voice tight. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, half expecting the eyes to appear once more. "I'm just driving. I'll be home soon." Mark was quiet for a moment, and Ethan could practically hear him thinking. "You don't sound fine. And what do you mean, driving? Where are you, man? You should have been home hours ago." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. The last thing he wanted was to talk about this. Talk about the eyes, the face, the thing he could feel behind him, no matter how fast he drove. I don't know," Ethan admitted, his voice cracking a little. I can't be home right now. Okay." There was a long pause. Ethan could hear Mark's breath on the other end of the line. "Look, man, if something's going on, you need to tell me. You've been acting strange, and I'm getting worried. I can come get you. Just tell me where you are." Ethan didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure he could even explain what was happening to him, let alone what he'd seen in that rearview mirror. The scratching. The words. "Where are you?" Mark pressed again, a little more firmly this time. "I'm not just letting you drive around like this. It's not safe." Ethan's eyes flicked the side of the road. His gaze caught on a small, dimly lit sign up ahead. An old mechanic's shop. It was tucked off the main highway, almost hidden by the fog. The lights were on, though, and he could see the faint glow of a neon OPN sign. "Actually," Ethan said slowly, the words feeling foreign in his mouth, "I think I need to stop. There's a mechanic's place up ahead. I'm gonna pull over and see if they can take a look at my car." Mark was silent for a long moment. "All right. But make sure you're not being stupid, okay? I don't want to hear some horror story tomorrow about you disappearing into the fog. Just be careful." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. "Yeah, I will. Thanks, man." He ended the call before Mark could say anything more and turned the wheel, steering toward the mechanic's shop. He didn't even know why he was doing it. It wasn't like there was anything wrong with the car. It wasn't like the car was the problem. But something was off. His mind was a mess of confusion and fear, and his only instinct was to do something. Anything. To break the cycle. To escape the presence in the rearview mirror. He pulled into the gravel parking lot with a squeal of tires, parking just in front of the single bay that was still open. The mechanic's shop looked as though it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years. The building itself was old, with a rusty metal roof and peeling windows. A few broken-down cars were scattered around the lot, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. Still, the neon light flickered above the bay, giving the place a strange, unsettling energy. Ethan sat in the car for a moment, trying to calm his breath. He didn't know what to expect. The place felt wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. But it was the only option he had. He pushed open the door and stepped out, the cold air biting at his skin. The gravel crunched underfoot as he walked toward the door, which was slightly ajar. He could smell motor oil and gasoline in the air, the metallic scent of the shop's tools mixing with the dampness of the night. Inside, the shop was dimly lit, but the sounds of engines, wrenches, and tools were almost comforting in their familiarity. A tall man with a grizzled beard stood behind the counter, his face creased with age, but his eyes sharp. He glanced up as Ethan entered. "Evening," the mechanic said in a low, gravelly voice. "What can I do for ya?" Ethan hesitated. There was a strange sense of urgency rising in him, but he didn't know how to explain it. What could he say? That something was following him. That he felt like the world around him had changed. I don't think there's anything wrong with my car," Ethan said, his voice coming out more strained than he intended. "But, something's happening. I need help. Something strange is going on. In the rearview mirror, something's following me." The mechanic raised an eyebrow, but didn't speak. Instead, he slowly nodded, as if he had heard this before. "Yeah, I've seen this kind of thing before," the mechanic said, his voice low. "You know, some folks get real jumpy after a while, start seeing things in the mirrors. And sometimes, it's not just in their head." Ethan blinked, the words sending a chill down his spine. He opened his mouth to say something, but the mechanic raised a hand to stop him. "Come on back here," the mechanic said, motioning toward the back of the shop. "Let me show you something." Ethan felt a wave of unease wash over him, but he followed the mechanic through the cluttered shop anyway. As they passed an old rusted car, Ethan saw something strange in the reflection of the dusty window. For just a moment, he thought he saw something move. He blinked. Nothing. But the unease continued to grow. The mechanic led him to a small workbench, and as he reached for a few old tools, he spoke again. "There's an old trick, you see. Cars sometimes pick up things they shouldn't. It's in the mirrors, usually." Ethan's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The mechanic smiled a thin, knowing smile. "Sometimes the mirror's the last place to let you know something's coming." Ethan's journey has led him to a mechanic who knows more than he should. The truth behind the eyes in the rearview mirror is starting to unfold. But what does it mean for Ethan? Keep reading to uncover the chilling mystery. Or share your thoughts below. What's your theory? Is it all in Ethan's mind, or is something darker at work? The mirror's truth. Ethan stood frozen, his stomach tightening as the mechanic's words echoed in his ears. The mirror's the last place to let you know something's coming. He didn't know whether to laugh or scream. He'd come here for help, for some kind of explanation, but the mechanic's cryptic words were making his skin crawl. He wasn't sure if the man was trying to warn him or just feed into his growing paranoia. Either way, the situation was spiraling out of control, and there was no turning back now. The mechanic's hands moved with surprising speed, grabbing a rusted metal toolbox from the workbench. As he opened it, Ethan could feel the weight of his presence, like something ancient and ominous was settling between them. "You said something's been following you," the mechanic said, not looking up from the toolbox. "Something you can see in the rearview mirror." Ethan nodded, his throat dry. The words felt stupid as they left his mouth, but it was the only explanation he had. "Yeah, eyes. A face. They keep getting closer." The mechanic didn't respond right away. He fumbled through the toolbox, pulling out a small, curved piece of glass. He turned it over in his hands like it was a delicate artifact, then set it down on the counter with a faint clink. Ethan leaned in, his curiosity piqued despite himself. He was beginning to think that whatever this mechanic knew, it wasn't going to make him feel any better. "What is that?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking a little. The mechanic's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for the first time, Ethan saw something there, something far darker than just a weathered face and tired eyes. It was as though the man knew something about Ethan's situation that he wasn't willing to say. "It's part of the mirror," the mechanic replied, his voice gravelly. "A piece of something that's not meant to be in there. It's why the reflections change, why the things in the mirror look different than they do in real life. It's a distortion, a crack in the world." Ethan felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. He opened his mouth to ask more, but the mechanic raised a hand to silence him. "I'm not saying you're crazy," the mechanic continued, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "I'm saying there are things that slip through the cracks. Things that shouldn't be in your reflection. That's why you see the eyes. And if you keep staring, it gets worse. You won't be able to stop it." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He had been expecting something like this, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. What was the mechanic talking about? What was the thing in the mirror? He took a shaky breath, trying to keep his composure. "How do I stop it?" The mechanic stared at him for a long time, then glanced back at the small piece of glass on the workbench. "You can't. Not entirely. Not without doing something about the source. You've got to sever the connection." The words were like a slap to the face. Sever the connection. How? What did that even mean? Ethan tried to steady himself, but the questions kept piling up, one after the other. "How do I do that? What's the source?" The mechanic's gaze was intense now, like he was weighing Ethan's soul in his mind. Finally, he spoke again, his voice just above a whisper. "You have to go back to where it all started." Ethan furrowed his brow. "What do you mean, where it started?" "I've been driving around. There's nothing special about the road. Nothing happened." The mechanic's lips twisted into a grim smile, as if he knew something Ethan didn't. "That's the problem. Nothing happened. Not yet, at least." Ethan stared at him, confused and terrified, trying to follow his logic. "You're not making sense." The mechanic sighed, then pushed himself away from the workbench. "I'll give you this. There's a place you need to go. You might not remember it, but your car will. It's a long way from here. A place that doesn't look like much. A dead end. The thing in your rearview mirror. It's not just following you. It's trying to pull you back." Ethan's mind raced. He had no idea what the mechanic meant, but a feeling gnawed at him, deep in his gut. Whatever this man was talking about, it had nothing to do with the road he was driving on. This was something deeper, something tied to his past. "Do you mean, like a place I've been before?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with the realization that whatever was happening to him was tied to something he couldn't fully remember. The mechanic nodded slowly. "Exactly. And once you get there, once you go back, the eyes will stop following you. You'll be able to see what's really there." Ethan's head spun with the possibilities. He was being told to go somewhere he didn't even remember, to confront something that had been haunting him for what felt like weeks. But was it weeks? It was hard to tell anymore. Time felt like it had warped, stretched and folded on itself until nothing made sense. "But how do I know where it is?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The mechanic hesitated. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, unfolding it carefully before sliding it across the workbench to Ethan. Ethan picked it up, his eyes scanning the small, jagged map that was drawn hastily with thick black ink. There was a series of winding lines that led to a small red X, but the name of the location wasn't marked anywhere. The only thing on the map was a single word written in block letters, scrawled at the top. Caverns Hollow. Ethan felt a cold chill run through him. It sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. It was almost like the name had been lodged in his subconscious, something buried deep. He'd heard it before, but when? And why? The mechanic's gaze softened as he saw the confusion in Ethan's eyes. "That's where you need to go. It's not far. Just a few hours out of town. If you don't, well, the thing will keep following you, and it won't stop until you let it take you." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest. "Take me? What do you mean, take me?" The mechanic didn't answer. Instead, he stood up from the workbench and made his way to the back of the shop. "You'll figure it out when you get there. You won't have much time once you do." Ethan was left standing in the dim light of the mechanic's shop, holding the map and feeling like a man caught in a web. The weight of what the mechanic had said hung in the air, suffocating him. There was no more running, no more denying what was happening. The eyes had been watching him, and now he had to face whatever lay at the end of the road. Whatever it was, he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Ethan's journey has brought him to a mechanic's shop, but the truth behind the eyes in the rearview mirror is darker than he imagined. The road ahead will take him to Caverns Hollow, but will he survive what awaits? The terror is only beginning. Keep reading to uncover the horrors lurking in the shadows, or share your thoughts below. What do you think Caverns Hollow holds? Is Ethan walking into his doom? Into the hollow. The drive was unbearable. Ethan had thought he could outrun the terror. He thought that if he just kept moving, just kept putting miles between himself and the nightmare in the rearview mirror, it would fade. But the closer he got to Caverns Hollow, the more suffocating the fear became. It clung to him like a second skin. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, and tried to keep his mind occupied with anything other than the words the mechanic had spoken. The eyes will stop following you if you go back to where it started. The map he had been given lay crumpled on the passenger seat, the jagged black lines of the roads leading him toward that dark red X. Ethan's mind raced. Where had he heard of Caverns Hollow? The name had seemed so familiar when the mechanic said it, but now it felt distant, as if it belonged to another version of himself. A version of Ethan that had lived some other life, in a world that was no longer real. But the more he drove, the more it gnawed at him, like a name he should have remembered but couldn't quite reach. It had been hours since he left the mechanic's shop. The road was beginning to thin out, the faint glow of city lights fading into the dark emptiness of the countryside. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches clawing at the sides of the road like fingers reaching for something just out of reach. The fog, which had been present for the past few days, had thickened as well, swirling on the edges of the highway, creating a thick veil of white that obscured the view ahead. The sound of his tires on the asphalt was the only thing he could hear, but even that seemed distant, muffled, like the world had already begun to fade. Ethan swallowed hard and glanced in the rearview mirror again. Nothing. For the first time in hours, the eyes were absent. The face, the malevolent presence, was gone. His heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment, a sliver of hope cracked through his panic. Maybe the mechanic was wrong. Maybe it wasn't following him anymore. Maybe, just maybe, he was getting away from it. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus on the road ahead. He couldn't afford to relax, couldn't afford to think for 1 second that it was over. His pulse was still hammering in his chest, and the unease had only grown stronger the closer he got to his destination. The map says I'm close, he thought, squinting through the windshield. There was a curve ahead, one he hadn't seen on the map, but it looked like it was the last turn before he reached his destination. The fog was so thick now that he could barely make out the outline of the road. He slowed down instinctively, hands tightening around the wheel. Suddenly, his headlights illuminated something in the distance. A sign. A rusted, faded sign that barely caught the light, but the word Caverns Hollow was unmistakable. It was the kind of sign that had seen too many years, the wood warped and cracked, the letters barely visible against the decay. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat. This was it. This was the place. He turned onto the narrow, gravel path that stretched out in front of him, the tires crunching against the stones. The fog seemed to deepen here, like the very air was thick with something he couldn't understand. The trees had closed in on either side, their trunks looming like silent sentinels in the dark. The farther he went, the more isolated he felt, like he was being swallowed whole by the woods. He tried to tell himself that this was just a town, a place on a map, a point in space like any other. But the fear crawling under his skin told him otherwise. It told him that Caverns Hollow wasn't just a name. It was a place that held something darker, something that had been waiting for him. And then, through the fog, he saw it. The cavern. It wasn't much to look at, not at first. Just a jagged, open hole in the side of a hill, the edges of the rock uneven and sharp, like teeth gnashing in the earth. The dark entrance seemed to breathe in the mist, swallowing the light from his headlights. Ethan slammed on the brakes. The car jerked to a stop just a few feet from the mouth of the cavern. His breath came in ragged gasps, the air inside the car suddenly feeling too thick, too heavy. His heart pounded, and his hands felt slick with sweat. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn around, to leave before it was too late. But he couldn't. Not anymore. He looked at the cavern again. The walls seemed to pulse in the fog, drawing him in. Something was waiting there, something he had to face. He stepped out of the car, his legs unsteady beneath him, as though the ground itself was shifting. The fog pressed against him, cold and clammy, like 1,000 invisible hands. He could hear his own breathing, the rasp of air in his chest, but there was something else, a soft, skittering noise, barely perceptible at first. His eyes flicked toward the cavern entrance. There was movement. At first, it was just a shadow in the dark, something shifting behind the veil of fog. Ethan's blood ran cold as he took a step back. His feet slid on the gravel, but he didn't fall. He didn't move either. The shape was growing, getting closer. He could see it now, a figure, or perhaps figures, emerging from the depths of the cavern. The silhouette was wrong, too tall, too thin, and the way it moved was unnatural, jerky, like it was being dragged from the dark. The scratching began again. The same scratching he'd heard in the rearview mirror. It was distant at first, like nails dragging against metal, but it quickly grew louder, sharper. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He had to move. He had to run. But his feet wouldn't obey him. He was rooted to the spot, his gaze locked on the cavern, on the dark shapes that were inching closer. The scratching grew louder. Closer. It was coming from all sides now, all around him. And then, just as he thought he couldn't take it anymore, he saw them. The eyes. They weren't in the mirror. They weren't behind him. They were in the fog, in the shadows. They were everywhere, blinking, unblinking, watching him. They were closing in. And that's when he realized the truth. The eyes weren't just following him. They were him. And he had been here before. Ethan has made it to Cavern's Hollow, but the truth is darker than he ever could have imagined. The eyes, his eyes, are closing in. What does this all mean? What is the connection between Ethan and the cavern? Can he escape the horrors that await? Keep reading to uncover the terrifying truth, or share your theories below. What do you think Cavern's Hollow really is? The eyes in the dark. The scratching was louder now. Ethan could hear it all around him, but it didn't make sense. The sound seemed to come from the rocks, from the trees, from the ground beneath his feet. But it wasn't just that. The scratching was inside his head. It crawled into his thoughts, tore through his memories, and twisted his perception. He was frozen. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The eyes blinked in the dark, 1,000 tiny pinpricks of light glowing from the fog, from the shadows that seemed to move on their own. They were all watching him. But they weren't just watching. They knew him. Ethan staggered backward, his breath coming in sharp gasps. His heart pounded in his chest, but it felt like the thudding was coming from the earth itself, as if the ground was alive, pulsing with a terrible rhythm. Ethan, a voice whispered, the sound so soft he could hardly make it out. He spun around, his eyes wide, trying to find the source. But there was nothing. Just the swirling fog, the shifting shadows. The voice came again. This time, it was louder. Ethan. It was a familiar voice. A voice from his past. His mother. He shook his head violently, trying to clear the fog from his mind. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. But it was. It was happening. The eyes were everywhere, watching him, pulling him into the depths of something dark, something ancient. The presence he had been feeling, the thing he had been running from for days, it was here. It was waiting for him. And he had let it here. Ethan. The voice was clearer now, echoing around him, reverberating through his skull. No, he thought, his mind desperately fighting to hold on to some sense of reality. This is a trick, a hallucination. But the scratching was getting louder. The darkness was growing deeper, closing in on him like a tide. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't fight it. The eyes. They weren't just reflections. They weren't just something he saw in the rearview mirror. They were part of him. He could feel them. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the pressure of their stare on his soul. The connection was real. It had always been real. The fog parted for just a moment, and he saw something in the distance, a shape, a silhouette standing just outside the mouth of the cavern. A figure, tall and thin, barely visible against the night. But its eyes shone in the darkness, two pools of black that seemed to pull at him, draw him in. And then it stepped forward. Ethan gasped, stumbling back, nearly tripping over his own feet. The figure's form seemed to shift, to blur and bend like smoke, and in the next instant, it was standing right in front of him. It was him. No. Ethan's breath hitched. He couldn't move. He couldn't look away. The figure before him was him. But older somehow. Worn. Tired. Its eyes were black holes, endless voids that seemed to pull him in deeper with each blink. He could feel them inside him. He could feel it breathing. This isn't real, he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached out with a pale, trembling hand. Ethan took a step back, his heart racing as the figure's eyes bore into him, into his very soul. No, get away from me, Ethan shouted, but his voice felt hollow, distant. His words were swallowed by the silence, as if the world itself had gone deaf to his pleas. The figure's hand closed around his wrist, its grip cold and unyielding. Ethan gasped, struggling to pull away, but the strength in the figure's hand was overwhelming. It wasn't just the figure holding him. It was something else. A force, a presence that was pulling him in. "You came here to find the truth," the figure said, its voice sounding like his own, but warped, distorted. "But the truth isn't something you can escape. It's inside you, Ethan. Always has been." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Ethan's mind reeled. His chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. You're not me." The figure's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was the smile of something else, something that had worn his face and walked in his shoes for far too long. "I am you," the figure said softly. "And you are me. We are the same." Ethan stumbled back, his vision swimming as the world around him seemed to collapse into darkness. He could still feel the eyes, those black, unblinking eyes. The figure wasn't just standing before him. It was inside of him. The connection was deeper than he'd ever understood. "No," Ethan breathed, his voice cracking as the weight of the truth crashed over him. "No, I can't be. I can't." The figure stepped closer, its eyes widening. "You can't escape what's already inside you, Ethan. You never could. The road you've been on, this has always been the end. This is where you belong. This is your home." The words pierced his mind like a blade. It wasn't a place. It wasn't a memory. It was him. Ethan had been running from himself all along. The figure reached forward again, but this time, Ethan didn't pull away. He was too tired to fight, too worn out to resist. The figure's hand settled on his shoulder, its cold touch spreading through his body like ice. "I didn't want this," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. "I didn't want to know." The figure nodded slowly, its eyes reflecting an ancient sorrow. "None of us do. But we always know, deep down. We always feel it. The eyes, those are your eyes. The ones that watch you from the rear view. The ones you can never escape. They were always meant to follow you." Ethan closed his eyes, but the darkness wasn't gone. It was in him now, wrapping around his soul. And the eyes, they were still watching. Not behind him, not in the mirror, but inside. And now, the figure was part of him. Ethan opened his eyes one last time, but the world was gone. The road, the fog, the trees, all of it was inside him. And the eyes watched. Always. Ethan has faced the horrifying truth. The eyes in the rearview mirror, the thing following him, it was always him. But what does this mean for Ethan's future? What is the true power behind the connection? The terrifying final chapter awaits, where the darkness will consume everything. Don't miss the last session. The final, heart-stopping conclusion is just around the corner. The final reflection. Ethan couldn't remember when he stopped walking. When the world became too dark to see, when the eyes consumed him completely. There was no more road, no more trees, no more fog, just the blackness that pressed in on him, the tight, suffocating pressure of something old and cruel that surrounded him. The darkness felt alive, as if it had always been here, waiting for him. Waiting for this moment. He was no longer sure if he was standing or sitting, if he was even alive. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred beyond recognition. His thoughts were thick with fog, the images in his mind like broken shards of glass. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, but he couldn't escape them. He couldn't escape himself. The figure that had once stood before him, the other him, was now gone, but it wasn't really gone. It was still there, deep inside him. A part of him. The dark reflection of his soul, the version of himself that had been buried for so long. The truth was undeniable now. The eyes were never some distant terror stalking him from the rearview mirror. The eyes were his own. The connection, the relentless pursuit, it was him chasing himself. A fractured part of his soul trying to pull him back into the darkness. And it had succeeded. Ethan's breathing quickened, his pulse spiking as he felt the weight of the knowledge settle over him. There was no escaping this. no escaping the truth of who he was. He had been running from a version of himself, a side of him that had always existed, always been there. The mirror wasn't just a tool of reflection. It was a door. A door to his past, to his regrets, to the pieces of himself he had tried to bury. It had been waiting for him. And now that he had arrived, it was too late. There was no going back. The sound of footsteps echoed in the dark, slow and deliberate. Ethan didn't need to turn around. He didn't need to see what was coming. He knew. "You've been running for so long," the voice whispered, low and cruel. It sounded like his own voice, but older, more twisted. "But now there's nowhere left to go, Ethan. This is it. This is where you're meant to be." He closed his eyes, shaking his head, trying to block out the voice, but it seeped into his mind like poison. It was too real. He was too deep in this place now to fight it. "I didn't want this," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. "You never wanted to face the truth," the voice answered, its tone mocking. "You never wanted to see what was right in front of you. But it doesn't matter anymore. You can't outrun it. You can't outrun yourself." The footsteps drew closer, and Ethan knew what was coming. He didn't need to turn around. He didn't need to look. Because the figure had already found him. It had always been with him. It was inside him. Ethan's chest tightened, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he found the strength to move. He spun around, his eyes locking onto the empty space behind him, where the fog had begun to swirl once more. And there, in the midst of the darkness, he saw it. The rearview mirror. It was hanging in the air, suspended like an omen. The glass gleamed with a dark light, reflecting nothing but the blackness around it. But he knew what it was showing. He couldn't look. He couldn't. But he did anyway. The reflection staring back at him wasn't his face. It wasn't the face he remembered. It was otherworldly. It was twisted. It was his dark side, the version of himself that had always been hidden. The eyes, those eyes, stared back at him with a cold, merciless gaze. They weren't just following him. They had always been him. The figure that had haunted him for days, the presence that had driven him to this place, was not a thing of evil, not an entity from another world. It was a piece of him. A part of his soul that he had rejected, a reflection of his own darkness, his fear, his guilt. He had spent his life running from it, but now it was all too clear. The eyes were trying to pull him toward the cavern. The eyes were pulling him toward the truth. And the truth was that he had never really left this place. He had never escaped the version of himself that he feared most. No matter how far he had run, no matter how many miles he had driven, it had been with him every step of the way. He had been chasing it, running from it, and it had always known where to find him. Ethan felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to touch the mirror. The surface of the glass rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. His hand reached out on its own accord, and as his fingers brushed the cool surface, the mirror seemed to come alive, distorting and warping around him. And then, with a sound like 1,000 whispers, the world shattered. The darkness collapsed into itself, and Ethan was falling. The fog had returned, thick and suffocating, but now it was different. It wasn't just mist. It was a liquid, a viscous substance that pulled at him, drowning him in its weight. The mirror was gone, and with it, all sense of reality. But through the fog, through the disorienting swirl of shadows and whispers, he saw something. A face. His own face. It wasn't the twisted reflection from the mirror. It was a different version of him. A version he had left behind long ago. A younger, more innocent face, before the fear had taken hold. Before the guilt. Before the darkness had consumed him. And in that moment, he realized what had to be done. He had been running from his past, from the mistakes he had made, the choices he regretted. He had believed that if he could outrun the eyes, outrun the reflection, he could leave it all behind. But the truth was simple. He couldn't escape himself. The darkness, the eyes, the terror, it was all part of him. And now, there was no more running. No more denial. The only way out was through. With a final, decisive breath, Ethan reached out to the face in the fog, and the eyes stopped watching. Ethan's journey has come to an end. The eyes, the fear, the relentless pursuit, it was all tied to him, to the darkest parts of himself. But what happens now? Can he find peace, or is he forever trapped in the reflection of his own soul? The terrifying truth has been revealed, and the final question remains. Is it possible to ever escape what's already inside us? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what you think of Ethan's fate. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey. Keep your mirrors close, and beware the eyes that might be watching from the dark.